In the year 1300, if you stood at the very center of Paris, the greatest, most alive city in the entire Western world, you would have been overwhelmed by the sheer, magnificent noise of it. 10,000 voices talking, arguing, laughing, praying, bargaining all at once. You would have smelled bread baking in stone ovens just around the corner, the sharp bite of horse dung steaming on wet cobblestones, threads of incense drifting lazily from the wide-open doors of Notre Dame Cathedral. You would have felt the morning sun warm on your face and watched merchants carry bolts of deep crimson silk through streets still glistening from the night's rain. Children chasing each other between market stalls, overflowing with bread and dried fish and autumn apples. The city was not just alive, it was radiant. It had the energy of a world that genuinely believed in itself. A world that had looked back at the centuries of darkness behind it and decided, with total confidence, that the worst was over. And that confidence was not irrational. The population of Europe had doubled in just 2 centuries. Cathedrals were climbing toward heaven with a technical ambition that would leave modern engineers speechless. Universities in Bologna, Oxford, and Paris were electric with philosophical debate and early scientific inquiry. Trade routes stretching from the coast of China all the way to the port of Lisbon were carrying silk and spice and ideas and possibilities. The world was not perfect. It never is. But it was expanding, and it knew it, and it was proud of that fact. Now hold that image in your mind. Hold the warmth of it, the sound of it, the smell of fresh bread and river water and possibility. Hold it, and then let me tell you what that same city looked like 50 years later. The streets were empty. Not quiet, empty. A cart moved slowly through the center of the city, pulled by a single exhausted horse, and on the cart were bodies, stacked like firewood. The market stalls were closed, the stone ovens cold, the children gone. Rats moved openly through the squares where merchants had once stood. And the silence was the most terrifying thing of all, because this city had never been silent, not once in living memory. And now it was as quiet as a tomb, because in every meaningful sense, that is precisely what it had become. 50 years, 1/3 of every voice you had heard gone, not conquered, not enslaved, not scattered by armies, simply erased. And this was not a story of one city or one country or one catastrophe. This was the story of an entire century. The 14th century, the most catastrophic 100 years in all of recorded human history. A century that did not destroy civilization with a single shattering blow, but bent it and bent it again and kept bending it. Through famine, through plague, through war, through social collapse. Until something fundamental, something deep in the architecture of the human world, finally snapped. This is the story of fire, of famine, of plague, and of what it truly means to survive something that was never supposed to be survivable.
Yes, and abundance
to understand what
for all.
was lost in the 14th century, you have to first understand what had been built in the centuries before it. Because what was built was extraordinary. What was built was a civilization operating at the absolute peak of everything it knew how to do. And it had taken 500 years of slow, grinding, largely anonymous human effort to get there. The 12th and 13th centuries, what historians call the High Medieval Period, represent one of the most sustained periods of human growth in the entire Holocene epoch.
Excuse me, coming
The Holocene is the geological era of climatic stability that began approximately 11,700 years ago when the last great ice age finally retreated and left behind a world warm enough, stable enough, and wet enough for human agriculture to genuinely take hold.
Let's get the next one.
But within that long arc of relative warmth, there was an even warmer chapter.
Hey, wait up!
A sustained climatic period that scientists now call the medieval climate anomaly, stretching from roughly 900 CE all the way to around 1300 CE, during which means surface temperatures across the northern hemisphere ran nearly 1.2 degrees Celsius above the long-term average.
How much for tomatoes?
Now, that number sounds modest. It sounds almost negligible. But climatology teaches us, in ways that are more relevant to our own moment than most people are comfortable acknowledging, that a single degree of temperature change does not merely alter the weather. It rewrites agriculture. It extends growing seasons by weeks. It pushes the frost line northward across entire regions. It transforms marginal, barely viable soil into productive, reliable farmland. And that is precisely, measurably, what happened across medieval Europe. From the British Isles to the plains of Poland, forests were felled and converted to farmland at a scale that would not be matched again until the Industrial Era. The German historian Wilhelm Abel documented in his landmark agrarian studies that the cultivated area of Central Europe tripled between the years 1000 and 1300 CE. Vineyards appeared in the south of England, regions that today are barely warm enough to sustain them even with modern agricultural technology. New villages were carved out of wilderness by the thousands across Germany, France, and Eastern Europe. The food surplus this generated was not a small thing. It was not merely a comfortable margin. It was the foundation of everything else that followed.
We must question everything, challenge the comfortable lies we've been told. True freedom begins in the mind, and it starts now.
Every piece of art.
Flawed,
Surplus
sir.
food is what allows a civilization to dream. Population surged. In 1000
Existentialism teaches that existence
the
comes
total
with rest.
population
We
of
define our
Europe
own meaning
stood
through
at
authentic
approximately
choices. This is the
38
core of
million
freedom.
people. By 1300, it had climbed to nearly 75 million. A doubling in 3 centuries that created new cities, new economies, new legal institutions, and new ambitions that no previous generation had had the luxury of entertaining. Think about what that surplus built.
I can't
the
believe you
Cathedral
did
of
this.
Chartres,
What are you
begun
talking
in
about?
1194,
Don't play dumb
is
with
not
me. I'm
merely
not. You're
building.
twisting it.
It is an argument. It is a civilization saying loudly and in stone, we have enough. We have enough bread, enough quarried limestone, enough skilled masons and architects and glaziers, and enough collective faith to raise something so vast and so beautiful that it will outlast every single one of us. The engineering precision of its Gothic flying buttresses, those elegant external stone arches designed to redirect the enormous lateral forces of the vaulted ceiling outward and downward, freeing the walls from any structural obligation and allowing them to become pure, glorious fields of colored glass, represents a sophistication in applied geometry and structural mechanics that still astonishes modern engineers when they study it closely. At the University of Paris, founded in 1150, scholars like Thomas Aquinas were doing something equally audacious. They were attempting to reconcile the ancient Greek tradition of rational, empirical philosophy, the tradition of Aristotle, of logical argument, of evidence and deduction, with the revealed theology of Christianity. It sounds like a narrow academic exercise. It was not. It was the foundational moment of the Western intellectual tradition. It was the first serious, sustained attempt to make reason and faith coexist within a single framework of thought, and the questions it raised about the relationship between evidence and belief, between individual conscience and institutional authority, had not stopped being asked since. And in the Islamic world, the intellectual situation was even more formidable. Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba hosted libraries and observatories and teaching hospitals that dwarfed anything in Christendom. Meanwhile, the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in all of human history, had, through its sheer violent dominance, created something it almost certainly did not intend. A corridor of relative peace and enforced security stretching from Beijing to Budapest, along which merchants and scholars and manuscripts and goods moved with an unprecedented freedom. Historians call it the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, and within it, the medieval world's first genuine experiment in globalization was quietly underway. And that interconnected, cosmopolitan, astonishingly productive world was extraordinary in every way. It was also, as the 14th century would demonstrate with savage clarity, extraordinarily vulnerable. Because every system of growth carries within itself the seeds of its own crisis.
Something's not right here.
The medieval
I feel it
climate
too. The air's too
anomaly
still.
had
Keep your eyes
allowed
open.
civilization to expand to the very outer edges of what the land and the climate could support. Every acre of farmland was needed. Every harvest was essential. The margin between abundance and disaster had, over 2 centuries of uninterrupted prosperity, been quietly, invisibly shrinking, and in the second decade of the 14th century, it disappeared entirely. The first crack in that world did not arrive
Something's wrong. Everyone stop!
It arrived as rain.
Closer.
In the spring of 1315, a high-pressure ridge that had reliably dominated northern European weather patterns for generations simply failed to assert itself. In its place came a low-pressure system that settled over the British Isles and northern France and refused, for months that stretched into seasons and seasons that stretched into years, to move. The result was the coldest, wettest summer in living memory. Crops rotted in the ground. Grain that had been planted with the confidence born of a century of good harvests drowned in waterlogged fields before it could be harvested. Then the following spring came, and the rains returned. And the spring after that. What was happening, we now understand, was the beginning of what paleoclimatologists call the Little Ice Age, a gradual but catastrophic shift in northern hemisphere temperatures driven by a convergence of two powerful forces happening simultaneously. The first was a measurable decrease in solar output, a period scientists identify as the Wolf minimum, which ran from approximately 1280 to 1350 and reduced the amount of solar radiation reaching Earth's surface. The second was volcanic, a series of massive eruptions in the early 14th century, including the eruption of Mount Tarawera in New Zealand around 1314, injected enormous quantities of sulfate aerosols into the upper stratosphere, where they acted as a reflective shield, bouncing solar warmth back into space before it could reach the ground. The fields of Europe, planted right to the very edge of their productive capacity, with no buffer, no reserve, no room for error, did not merely yield less. They collapsed. Imagine a woman in a small village in northern France in the winter of 1316. Her name is unknown to us because history does not preserve the names of dying peasants. But the Franciscan chronicler Jean d'Avenette, writing from memory and testimony, describes what she and millions like her were living through with a directness that is almost unbearable to read. He describes parents abandoning children on roadsides because they could not feed them. He describes children found eating the corpses of the dead. He describes a hunger so total, so unrelenting, that it had, in his own words, made entire communities hard and without pity, because each person thought only of themselves, only of surviving one more day, and there was simply nothing left over for compassion. This woman, let us stay with her for a moment, is boiling a leather boot in a pot of water over her hearth fire, because there is nothing else left to put in the pot. Her children sit around her in silence. They are past the stage of crying from hunger. They have learned that crying uses energy they cannot spare. She stirs the pot and stares into the water and tries not to think about what next week looks like, because there is no answer to that question that she can bear. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 killed between 10 and 15% of Northern Europe's total population. Somewhere between 5 and 7 million people died, not in battle, not from plague, but from the oldest and most fundamental human catastrophe. There was not enough food. And beyond the raw death toll, it did something perhaps even more consequential on a longer timescale. It weakened the survivors. Immunologists studying skeletal remains excavated from famine-era mass graves in England, Belgium, and northern France have found consistent evidence of what is called childhood immune priming failure. A generation of children raised in conditions of chronic malnutrition during their most critical developmental years did not build the robust immune systems of their parents. Their bodies have been forced to make impossible choices, to spend biological resources on basic survival and growth rather than immune development. They lived, but they were not the same people their parents had been. And that distinction, that invisible physiological diminishment, would matter enormously within a single generation. Because in 1347, the second catastrophe arrived. In October of that year, a merchant ship docked in the harbor of Messina on the northeastern coast of Sicily. Dock workers approached the vessel in the ordinary way, ready to unload whatever cargo it carried. And then they stopped. Some of the sailors were dead at their oars. The ones who were still alive were in a condition that the witnesses struggled to describe. Covered in swellings the size of eggs in their armpits and groins, blackened with subcutaneous bleeding, feverish beyond coherence, weeping dark fluid from their skin. The dock workers backed away. The port authorities ordered the ship out of the harbor immediately. It was already too late. The ship had come from Kaffa, a Genoese trading post on the Crimean Peninsula on the northern coast of the Black Sea, where it had been caught up in one of the most darkly consequential moments in the entire history of military conflict. The city had been under siege by the Mongol forces of Yani Beg Khan, whose army had been devastated by a mysterious disease tearing through their camps. Yani Beg, in an act of tactical brutality that history has never quite decided how to classify, ordered the catapulting of infected corpses over the walls of Kaffa into the city beyond. The Genoese merchants inside, overwhelmed and desperate, loaded their ships and fled, and they carried the disease with them into every port they touched on the way home. The pathogen was Yersinia pestis, a gram-negative, rod-shaped bacterium that had evolved over millions of years in the rodent populations of the Central Asian steppe, particularly in the Great Marmot colonies of what is now Mongolia. It traveled between rodent hosts via the bite of the rat flea, Xenocilichiopes, and it had not one but 3 distinct modes of killing. In its bubonic form, it attacked the lymph nodes, producing those characteristic hemorrhagic swellings, buboes, that gave the Black Death its later name. Death followed within 3 to 5 days and came for between 30 and 75% of those infected. In its septicemic form, the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, causing massive internal hemorrhaging, the blackening of skin from bleeding beneath its surface, and death within 24 hours, often before buboes even had time to form. And in its pneumonic form, the most terrible of the 3, the infection reached the lungs and became airborne, transmissible through a cough, through a breath, through a single word spoken across a crowded room. Pneumonic plague was nearly 100% fatal. Think about what that means. A disease that you could catch by simply standing near someone who is already dying. Consider a cloth merchant in Florence in the spring of 1348. He locks his warehouse and walks home quickly, pulling his cloak close around him, his eyes down. He passes a house where the door has been nailed shut from the outside and a red cross painted on the wood. He does not stop walking. He has learned not to stop. At home, his wife has been sick for 3 days. The swelling under her arm appeared on a Tuesday morning, the size of a walnut. By Tuesday evening, it was the size of a hen's egg, hot and hard and exquisitely painful. By Thursday, it was the size of a closed fist, weeping dark fluid, and she screamed when he came near it. The physician had come and charged 3 times his normal fee and left without saying anything. The chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the Florentine plague of 1348 and wrote about it with a reporter's precision in the preface to his Decameron, describes watching the entire architecture of social obligation collapse in real time. Sons abandoned fathers. Husbands abandoned wives. The clergy, whose duty called them closest to the dying, died in extraordinary numbers. And the city, beautiful, wealthy, cultured Florence, the crown of the Italian Renaissance to come, buried its dead in mass graves that filled faster than they could be dug. Boccaccio estimated that 100,000 people died in Florence between March and July of 1348. Florence's total pre-plague population had been roughly 90,000. He was either counting the refugees who had flooded into the city before the gates were shut, or he was writing from a trauma so profound that the numbers had ceased to feel like numbers and had become something closer to a color of absolute loss that no figure could fully capture. Across Europe, the total scale of what happened between 1347 and 1351 remains almost impossible to hold in the human mind as a single thought. Modern demographic historians, working painstakingly from surviving parish records, tax documents, estate inventories, and the physical evidence of excavated plague pits, including the remarkable mass burial discovered beneath Charterhouse Square in London in 2013, which contains skeletal remains with confirmed Yersinia pestis DNA dating precisely to 1348. Estimate that the Black Death killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people globally. In Europe alone, the population fell from approximately 75 million to somewhere between 50 and 55 million. 1 in 3 people dead in 4 years. And then the century still wasn't finished. The Black Death did not end in 1351. It came back in 1361, what contemporaries call the Pestis Secunda, the Second Plague. And this wave killed with particular, almost targeted savagery among children born after the first outbreak, those who had no immunity because they hadn't been alive to survive the first round. It returned in 1369, in 1374, in 1390. The 14th century ended with Europe in a state of permanent, bone-deep psychological siege. A world in which nobody could be certain that the person they kissed goodbye in the morning would still be alive when they came home. And running alongside the plague, woven through every decade of it like a second dark thread, was war. The 100 Years' War between England and France, which began formally in 1337, was not merely a dispute over dynastic succession. It was, in practical terms, a systematic economic assault on the French countryside conducted over generations. English armies and their allied mercenary companies, the routiers, the free companies, professional soldiers with no permanent employer and no particular interest in peace, burned crops, poisoned wells, slaughtered livestock, and burned villages in the intervals between major battles, methodically destroying the agricultural infrastructure that the surviving peasantry depended on to stay alive. And the French peasant who had survived the Great Famine, who had survived the Black Death, who had watched their children buried in plague pits and their fields torched by passing armies, finally reached the absolute limit of what a human being can absorb and still remain passive. In May of 1358, in the Beauvaisis region north of Paris, they stopped being passive, without planning, without leaders, without a coherent political program. Men and women who had simply run out of the capacity to endure more picked up whatever was in their hands, scythes, pitchforks, axes, farming tools, and they turned on the noble estates around them with a ferocity that shocked every chronicler who wrote about it. They burned castles. They dragged knights from their horses. They did to the noble class what the noble class had been doing to them. And the terror in the aristocratic accounts of the uprising is real and visceral, because for a few weeks, nobody could predict where it was going to stop. The nobility crushed it within 6 weeks. The reprisals killed an estimated 20,000 people. But the scream, that raw, desperate, human scream, had been heard across Europe, and it would go on echoing for a very long time. Something fundamental
we must
had
question
changed in the
everything,
world
challenge the comfortable lies we've been told. True freedom begins in the mind,
It was not just
and it
that there were
starts now.
fewer people. It was that the people who remained had been permanently altered in their bodies, in their psychology, in their relationship with every institution and authority they had previously accepted without question. The medieval social contract, that ancient hierarchical arrangement in which lords held land and serfs provided labor, and the church mediated between both of them and God, had been built on a single foundational assumption.
I can't believe you did this.
That labor was abundant
about?
and land was scarce.
Don't play dumb with me.
The Black
I'm not.
Death
You're twisting
inverted
it.
that equation entirely and instantaneously. Suddenly, land was everywhere. Fields lay untended across the entire continent. Whole villages stood empty, their inhabitants gone to the same plague pits as the lords who had once owned their labor. And the survivors, having watched their masters die of exactly the same disease that killed the lowest field hand, having seen the absolute democratic equality of death up close, understood something that could not be unforgotten. They had something the surviving aristocracy desperately, urgently needed. Their hands, their strength, their work. And for the first time in centuries, they could negotiate from a position of power. Wages rose dramatically across Europe in the decade following the Black Death. And the ruling class's response, panicked, legislative, ultimately feudal, tells you everything about how significant the shift was. The English Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, attempting by law to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It failed. The market was stronger than the law. In England, France, Germany, and across the Italian city-states, the price of labor doubled and then doubled again. Serfs who had been legally bound to their lord's land simply walked away, because there were too few enforcers left to stop them, and too many desperate landowners elsewhere willing to offer better terms to anyone willing to work. The 14th century did not end feudalism by itself, but it broke its spine. It created the conditions, the upward mobility, the wage labor, the movement of people between regions and social classes that would, over the following 2 centuries, transform European civilization into something structurally unrecognizable from what it had been. And there is another inheritance, stranger and harder to see, but perhaps the most consequential of all, the constant, intimate presence of death, the companion that walked beside every European for every decade of the 1300s, fundamentally altered the human relationship with mortality, with authority, and with the sacred. The Church, which had claimed for centuries to be the institution that could explain suffering, manage sin, mediate between humanity and God, and protect the righteous through prayer and sacrament, had failed with a completeness that was impossible to rationalize away. It could not pray the plague away. Its priests died at the same rate as its sinners. Its theology of suffering as divine punishment, the idea that pain was meaningful, comprehensible, managed, had been shredded by a bacterium that made no moral distinctions whatsoever.
Hold up.
The flagellant movement that
right
swept
here.
through
Yeah,
Germany and the Low Countries
still.
between
Keep your eyes
1348 and 1350. Those white-robed processions of men flogging themselves bloody through town squares as crowds watched in reverence and horror was not a mass outbreak of hysteria. It was rational theology in a state of crisis. It was people who believed genuinely and deeply that if the plague was God's punishment, and if God had not been sufficiently satisfied by prayer and confession and righteous living, then perhaps the answer was more suffering,
something's wrong. Everyone
more
stop,
visible,
back.
more extreme,
closer.
more undeniable suffering that God could not possibly overlook. The Church condemned it, but the underlying doubt that produced it did not disappear just because the processions were banned. The question that the Black Death planted in the European consciousness was quiet but corrosive. If God could not be appealed to, and if the Church could not effectively mediate that appeal, then what exactly was the Church for? That question would not find its formal, civilization-shaking answer until 1517, when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg. But the question itself, the fracture in faith's foundation, was born in the plague years of the 1340s. The Protestant Reformation was, in ways that are rarely fully acknowledged, a direct child of the Black Death. The plague also did something that no political movement, no military campaign, and no deliberate intellectual program had managed to accomplish. It broke the monopoly of Latin. For centuries, Latin had been the exclusive language of scholarship, law, administration, and theology, a deliberate gatekeeping mechanism that kept intellectual and spiritual authority firmly in the hands of those trained by church institutions. But the Black Death killed so many Latinists, so many monks and priests and scribes and notaries, that knowledge had to find new vessels simply to survive. Writers began, out of necessity and then out of genuine artistic ambition, recording in the vernacular. Boccaccio wrote the Decameron in Florentine Italian. Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales in Middle English. Dante's Divine Comedy, completed in 1320, had been written not in the language of the church, but in the language of the street. The foundational idea of modern Western literature, that stories and ideas belong to everyone and not only to those with clerical training, was seated in the catastrophe of the 14th century. And perhaps most humbling of all, the pathogen at the center of all of this, Yersinia pestis, did not disappear when the 14th century ended. In 2011, a team of researchers at Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz published the first fully reconstructed genome of the Black Death strain, assembled from ancient DNA extracted from skeletal remains found in the East Smithfield mass burial site in London, a grave dating precisely to 1348 and 1349. What they found confirmed what epidemiologists had long suspected. The bacterium that killed a third of Europe was not some extinct, unrepeatable aberration of the distant past. It was a variant of an organism that is still alive and active today. It still circulates in rodent populations across Central Asia, across the American Southwest, across parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Between 2010 and 2020, the World Health Organization recorded thousands of confirmed human plague cases globally. In 2017, Madagascar experienced an outbreak of pneumonic plague, the airborne variant, that killed over 200 people and required emergency international response. Yersinia pestis did not die in 1351. It is simply waiting. Stand in the center of Florence today and look up at Brunelleschi's dome. That magnificent, improbable, soaring cap of stone and brick that he finished in 1436, and that has never been surpassed. It is the supreme achievement of the Renaissance. But here's what the postcards and the tourist guides and the art history lectures rarely tell you. The Renaissance did not happen despite the 14th century. It happened because of it. The destruction of the old order created space for new ideas that the old order would never have permitted. The shattering of church authority created room for the human-centered philosophy that placed man, rather than God's intermediaries, at the center of intellectual life. The labor shortage created social mobility for people who had been permanently fixed to the bottom of the hierarchy. The intimate, unavoidable, daily familiarity with death created in the survivors a hunger, desperate, gorgeous, almost violent for beauty, for painting and sculpture and architecture and music that insisted on human dignity in the face of the memory of the plague pits. The Renaissance was not born in the sunlight. It was born in the rubble. The people of the 14th century did not know they were living through the worst 100 years in recorded history. That perspective requires distance we have, and they did not. They only knew that the world they had been born into, the world their parents had described to them as a birthright, a given, an inheritance they could rely on, was gone. And they faced the choice that every generation facing catastrophe has always faced: to believe that something worth living for could still be built from the ruins, or to surrender to the darkness and call it permanent. They chose to build, without antibiotics, without epidemiological models, without international institutions or emergency relief systems or safety nets of any kind. They built with prayer and with labor and with each other, and even those the plague had taken over and over again, without mercy or logic or discernible purpose. And yet here we are, walking the streets they paved, asking the questions they first dared to ask, reading the literature they wrote in the languages of
never listen to us.
because they understood in the wreckage of everything they had known that ideas too precious to share are ideas that die with their keeper.
You're crazy.
We are not observers of the 14th century. We are not students of it from a comfortable distance. We are its inheritors,
Please help
its
me.
survivors.
No,
Everything we
stay
have
away from
built,
us.
Can't help. Get back.
every institution,
Please, I beg
every
you.
freedom, every philosophical tradition, every hard-won right to question authority and demand accountability from power was paid for, in some part, by people whose names we will never know, who lived in a
The gods are
century
near. We
so
must be
brutal
swift.
that it
Patience,
makes
the
our
signal
worst
will come,
modern
but we are
fears
ready to
feel,
strike.
if only briefly, small. The question that history asks us, the question that the 14th century asks specifically and without apology, is not whether catastrophe is coming. It always is. The question is simply this: what kind of people do we choose to be when it arrives? The candle that survived the storm is still burning. Whether we tend it is entirely up to us. Fade to black. Silence.